Welcome to the Great Loop Radio podcast, brought to you by America's Great Loop Cruisers Association. We're dedicated to sharing Great Loop information and inspiration with those actively cruising, planning for, or dreaming about a Great Loop adventure. I'm Kim Russo. I'm the director of AGLCA, and today we are continuing our series on the story of our Great Loop. Today we've got Randy and Cathy with us, and they did the Great Loop on a larger boat for the Great Loop. It's a West Bay Sonship, and we'll let them give you all of the details about their boat. Before I officially introduce Randy and Cathy, I do want to take a moment, as I always do, to recognize and thank our Admiral sponsors who support AGLCA at the highest level. They are Curtis Stokes and Associates, Passage Maker Trawler Fest, and Skipper Bob Publications, and of course Waterway Guide Media, which owns Skipper Bob Publications. So they're kind of one and the same, but two sponsors. So we appreciate all of those Admiral sponsors. And with the business out of the way, Randy and Cathy, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us. We're pretty excited to do this for you.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk with you. We, of course, had some time to catch up last summer in Georgian Bay. We ended up in Perry Sound at the same time, which was really neat because I hadn't seen you since when you did the loop a few years back at one of our spring rendezvous. I think I remember because, and as we'll get into, your boat's pretty memorable when you see it coming into a harbor.
Well, sometimes, yes, that's for sure. We do get queries about it.
Yeah.
When you're flagged in Honduras and have a motorcycle up on the fly bridge, and generally people gather around.
Yeah, it's two things you don't see a whole lot, especially on a looper boat. So we'll talk about that because I think there's probably motorcycle enthusiasts whose ears have perked up and they are now listening intently to see how you pulled that off on a Great Loop boat. But let's kind of start from the beginning. Tell us a little bit about the two of you and your boating experience before the Great Loop, because you did boat extensively before you took off on the loop.
Yeah, we had, I guess, a few pocket cruisers is what I call them, 24 and 30-foot cruisers that you could spend the night on, kind of weekend cruising. We upgraded to a 33-foot chaparral. And we had a home on the navigable waterway. So we started cruising extensively. And we're getting further and further abroad and started learning more about navigation, and rather than just going to the sandbar for the weekend party kind of thing. And we heard about the Great Loop back in the 90s from one of our friends. And we often thought that it would be neat to do that. Never really planned for it or considered it, but as time went on and we got a little more experience under our belt, and we'd done we lived in Canada and we had done the Trent Severn a couple of times, and we went through locks from where our home was to get into Georgian Bay and cruise that area. And we had friends and family with homes and cottages in Georgian Bay, so we always had places to go. So eventually, we decided that we're going to upgrade and spend more time cruising and try and get further abroad. Arguably, the Great Lakes is the best freshwater boating in the world. So not taking advantage of that when you are a boating enthusiast is a little silly. So that's kind of where we got started. And then we upgraded to our 58-foot, and we chose it more for our lifestyle rather than to do the loop. And then once we had it and we were halfway around, we just kind of accidentally said, instead of storing it for the winter this time, why don't we head down the inland rivers? At least we'll be able to say we completed our loop and we can store it in Florida for the winter instead of in Canada. So that was basically the long and short of how we got started and how we got to where we are.
Yeah. So the first half of the loop, you bought the boat in Florida, correct? And moved it up the East Coast to get it back to your home in Canada. So
that's right.
Tell us about the boat. Tell us what kind of boat. Give us her specs and your thoughts on it as a looping boat.
So it's a custom built yacht. They're built in Delta, BC, and in Seattle, Washington. They're 58 feet long, 3 cabins, 3 staterooms in it. Fairly complicated systems. It comes with twin engines and dual controls, pilots, a raised pilot house. So you have flybridge and pilot house controls. And then also controls on the aft deck. And, all the conveniences of a home, if you will, the washer, dryer, and microwave, and ovens, and stoves, and full-size fridges, and ice makers,
water maker,
and all the fun stuff. So it's a bit more complicated than most boats that you would need to do the loop. But it's what we had, and it's what we needed for the lifestyle we were living at the time. And so that was what we did the loop with. It's a deep draft. It's about 5.5 feet. So it's a little nerve-wracking if you're not used to dealing with that. You certainly couldn't do the Trent Severn in it, or I wouldn't recommend it, that's for sure. You'd want something a little shallower to do that with. There's some skinny water in there, and it's unforgiving in the Canadian Shield. But going through the Welland Canal is another experience, and so being able to experience that on your loop, and you can always get back into Georgian Bay by going up around the Bruce Peninsula and through Tobermory and some of those areas, and it's a nice cruise up that way as well. There's some wonderful ports there. And if you really don't want to go into Canada, you can, for the Americans, you can continue up the Michigan coast, and you don't even really need to go into Canada. But you'd miss some of the best parts of the Great Lakes. Georgian Bay and the North Channel are spectacular boating areas.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful areas to cruise. What's the typical cruising speed for you?
We found our sweet spot at about 10 knots. The boat, the actual cruising speed of the boat, because it's semi-displacement, is generally about 16, 17 knots. But you're burning arguably 50 or 60 gallons an hour of fuel, and at 10 knots we're burning 12 gallons of fuel an hour. So
that helps make the decision.
So that certainly helps make the decision, and at
that's
the same
a big
time,
difference.
Yeah, oh for sure. And at the same time, we're kind of looky-loos. We like enjoying our cruise. We like looking around. We like moving around the boat when we're underway, and so going fast takes a little bit of that away, and doesn't allow you to do some of the stuff that you want to do.
Yeah, well, that the Perch, our boat, has been around the loop a few times at this point. And Michael did it aboard at a much faster pace the first time. 10 knots has been our sweet spot this time too. And I've been the stickler for that, largely because of that difference in fuel burn, and because fuel prices have been so high. And of course they are coming down some, but they were kind of at their peak during our loop. And we're starting to look at those numbers. As much as I said, I really didn't want to know. And the cost for fuel is probably going to be about the same on this loop as it was on his last loop, even though we went much slower. And it's just the difference in the price per gallon or per liter. And he's just shaking his head going, we went so slow. How did this happen? So,
well,
it was one of those.
I think we spent 5,000 on fuel to get from the Great Lakes down to Florida, and or a little under 5,000. And it would probably cost us 10,000 today, because of when we were on the loop. I think fuel was between $2 and $2.25, and so you're close to $5 now anywhere on the water. So
yeah, that's exactly his problem. We probably burned half the fuel as his last loop, but spent the same amount of money. So not fun, but it's one of those things that it is what it is. You've planned for this, and yes, the fuel bill was substantially more than we had planned, but we were already up in the Great Lakes when it really, or at least in New York when it started to peak. So what are the options at that point? Turn around and burn the fuel to go back to Charleston, and then pay for slippage for another year. And so we kept going, and we're so happy that we did. But so we're talking about the boat. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the motorcycle, since you remain the only boat I know of that took a motorcycle with them on the loop.
Well, it was part of our lifestyle decision. I've owned a bike for many years, and go on bike rides, and The biking community is much like the RVing community, which is much like the boating community. Once you're out there, everybody kind of gathers around, and it's pretty much a social event. And so I had the room on the deck. I had to do some reconfiguring and make a cradle for it, and I had the davit that could get it up and down, and so I just decided, you never know what we're going to do. We were thinking about running up and down the East Coast and doing some extensive cruising. So it's always nice to have wheels when you get to where you're going. There's not always cars available, and there's not always transportation available. So it was handy to be able to just unload the motorcycle and go for a ride inland and visit friends and family and those types of things and places and stuff. So it was we already had the motorcycle, so it was just a matter of making a cradle and figuring out how to get it up and down.
Yeah.
And then it became certainly I don't know, a crowd attraction whenever we're loading or unloading it in a marina.
Yeah, lowering the bike onto the dock is always interesting. It does draw a crowd, makes me very anxious, and I don't know why, because it runs smooth as silk every single time. But it's pretty interesting watching that bike hang over the side of the boat.
Oh yeah, I'm sure it is. So most people would use that davit for their tender. So do you have a tender aboard, or did you opt out of a tender in favor of a motorcycle?
No. The tender goes behind the motorcycle. Motorcycle goes on first, and then the tender goes on, and then unloading, of course, it's opposite. But for a lot of the time, because we anchor out quite a bit, and we like dinging around, we're generally towing our tender behind the boat, and particularly in the Great Lakes. And so the motorcycle sits up on top, and we tow the tender, and so we have access to both if we need to. We generally don't unload the motorcycle when we're at anchor, but it would be nice if we could.
So you did mention that you anchor a lot. One of the things I like to ask all of our gold loopers is tell us a little bit about your cruising style or your cruising preferences. How many miles per day did you typically travel? We already talked about 10 knots being your sweet spot, but did you largely anchor or largely use marinas? Those kinds of things.
I would say on average, we would be probably a 50-50. We're pretty self-sufficient, so we really only need to go into port for fuel or a pump out unless we're in the Bahamas or offshore. So we would generally cruise until, I don't know, early afternoon, mid-afternoon, and particularly if there was a place we wanted to be, whether it was an anchorage or a town with a marina. And then we would explore that town or that anchorage with the dinghy, or do the things that was causing us to stop there and have a look around. And so it would depend on what it was, what area we were in. The odd time, especially on the inland rivers, there were times that we anchored simply because that's all there was in the area to reach. We would typically do 50 to 100 miles a day. Not much more than 100 miles would be a big day for us. We'd be leaving, right at sun up and getting in, 12 hours later, basically, to get 100 miles or so in, particularly if there was locks or bridges that we had to wait for.
We have done a couple of night cruises. We did, traveled all night, all day and all night, and all day and all night. So that puts a whole different spin on things.
And did you do that during your loop, or was that before or after?
Both. First bought the boat in Fort Lauderdale. When we came up, we were, like I say, we were in a rush to kind of get back to Canada. We had a target date of July 1st to pick up some friends in Canada. And so we left Norfolk and pulled into the Chesapeake about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we were thinking we'd just cruise up and maybe anchor in one of the spots just north along the coast. And And it was a beautiful afternoon. The weather was perfect, and we thought, well, what the heck, it's a fairly big bay, not much in your way. You can hunker down and head her up. So we just timed it so that we got to the north end of the bay by 7 in the morning and down through the Delaware, and we thought we'd stick our nose out at Cape Fear and or Cape May, and it was another beautiful afternoon. So we thought, well, we might as well keep going. So we headed all the way up and pulled into Sandy Hook about midnight, I think, that night.
Wow, that's a pretty long passage.
Yeah, she was a big long passage, but there's 4 of us on board, so everybody could get a rest. And
Yeah.
Gotcha.
we were going by Atlantic City. It was kind of funny. Must have been about 7 or 8 or no, just after dark. Must have been about 9 o'clock because this was in the spring.
Yeah.
And they set off fireworks for us going by. I don't know. I think there was some sort of celebration or something going on.
We decided it was for our.
We decided it was for us.
There you go. So one more question specific to the boat. 58 feet is not, it's certainly on the larger side for looper boats by length, but there are others that are out there. But the 5.5 foot draft is probably more of a hindrance. The length really doesn't cause any issues. You mentioned that, you didn't feel like you could do the Trent Severin in that. Any other issues related to having a little bit of a deeper draft than some other boats?
Well, certainly there's some issues getting in and out of some of the marinas that have the skinny water. Grafton, as an example, you got to kind of make sure the pool levels are accommodating you. We were plowing a little bit of mud getting in and out of there. We stopped at Ivy Yacht Club, and you're plowing a little bit of mud getting in and out of there as well. But other than that, it really didn't restrict us. I wouldn't have bought that boat to do the loop because of the inland rivers. It's got exposed running gear and it makes you fairly vulnerable. And particularly with the deep draft, I wouldn't have done it. But like I say, it's what we had, and it was doable. We never really had any issues. Over the years, I think we've had the boat 10 years. We certainly dinged the props a few times with some of the places that we like to try and get into. But, it's never really caused us any grief. One of the funny stories, we were going through the lock just before Poppies, and we pulled out, and all of a sudden there's a big vibration on the boat. And so I called ahead to Fern and talked to her. So she said, no problem, pull in, we'll get a diver out here in the morning. So we limped in on one engine, and the diver came out, and by 8 o'clock he had probably a 3 foot high pile of barge rope that they use to tie the barges together. It's great big, I don't know, 4-inch or 6-inch rope that was all wrapped around the prop and the shaft.
He pulled it up and covered the entire transom. It was
covered the entire swim platform on that boat.
Yeah.
Wow. Good thing there was a diver in close proximity for that one.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and let's take a break and play some messages from our sponsors. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about the other pretty unique thing you mentioned about your boat, other than the boat itself, and that is that it is flagged in Honduras. So we'll talk a little bit about how that affects the loop as well. We'll be back in a moment. Cutterman Marine Services is a vessel relocation and delivery service owned and operated by retired and former members of the U.S. Coast Guard. They have crews ready to exceed your expectations wherever your vessel is located. In addition to relocation and delivery services, they offer a host of other marine services such as new owner training. Check out their website at www.cuttermanllc.com or call 855-65-BOATS. You have a lot invested in your boat. Why would you trust it to someone other than the Cutterman? Cutterman Marine Services. Professional, knowledgeable, capable, experienced. Life is better by the bay. Here in Panama City, Florida, we have deep blue water surrounded by arts and culture. We love our historic neighborhoods, southern coastal cuisine, and the songs and stories of our locals, and we're sure you will too. If you're traveling along America's Great Loop, Drop your anchor at St. Andrews Bay in Panama City and enjoy easy access to waterfront restaurants and shopping, a favorite among loopers. Land or water, you're going to love it here. Visit destinationpanamacity.com and learn more. We're back on Great Loop Radio. Today we are continuing our story of our loop series with Randy and Cathy. They did the loop in a West Bay Sonship, a 58-foot. And we have already talked about the fact that Randy brings his Harley with him and carries that on the deck. But the other thing that kind of draws some attention for you two is the flag, since you are flagged Honduras. Tell us a little bit about that. And, specifically how that affects doing the loop, because we do have more and more folks coming from international locations to do the loop. Some additional hoops usually for them to jump through. So tell us how you went about that.
Yeah, well, some of the hoops that they have to jump through aren't quite as complicated for us because we're Canadian citizens, so we don't have that issue. The boat itself, when you enter the U.S., you can get a year-long cruising permit, which manages to have the boat in there for a year. As Canadian citizens, we can stay in the U.S. for up to 6 months without having to exit. So there's just a matter of timing it. So either, as a Canadian, you're generally exiting the U.S. to go to the Bahamas on your loop. Arguably the best saltwater boating in the world, so why wouldn't you go there? And so it generally looks after itself as you're doing the loop as a Canadian. The foreigners from Australia and the Netherlands that I've seen that are AGLCA members, it's a little bit more complicated for them because they have different personal visitation lengths of stay. And I'm not 100% familiar with how all that works, but it's a bit more complicated. It's also more complicated if you're going to buy a U.S. flag boat as a foreigner and then try to operate it in U.S. waters as a foreigner. So there's some complications to that type of setup. But for us, entering the U.S. was pretty simple. Entering Canada is the same type of thing. We can keep the boat in Canada for 6 months without exiting. And you don't have to exit for 15 days like you do in the U.S. after your cruising permit is up. You have to exit the U.S. for 15 days before you can renew it. In Canada, we can just pop across the border into the U.S. because it's a border country. Most of the Great Lakes have a border for each of the countries, so it's pretty simple just to pop across, spend the night, come back, and then you re-enter for another 6 months. Storage, if you're gonna, if your 6 months is up or your time is going to be over in Canada, there's a way to go through a process where you can get an extension and keep the boat there for up to a year as well. So a few years when we stored the boat in Canada, we would just get that extension when we were storing it, and it would be safe and sound there as well. So for us, it really wasn't that complicated. You just had to do some research, and you had to understand the regulations, and they aren't put into place to deter people from doing it. It's just, how do you work with them to make it work for you? That's all.
But having said all that, we have been boarded probably 3 times, possibly 4, by Homeland Security. And I think simply because we were flagged Honduran. They were always wonderful. There was never any problem. They were always extremely polite and very kind when they came on board. But the flag made them stop, and made them stop us. So it was an interesting encounter. So that was,
yeah. Well, we were cruising up the St. Mary's River towards Lake Superior one year, and they specifically pulled us over because we had a Honduran flag. They couldn't believe there was a ship from Honduras that far north.
Yeah.
And one of the officers that was on the Homeland Security detail was from Honduras, so we wanted to talk to us and find out where we were from.
Perfect.
So it was interesting. So it creates those types of interactions, and particularly at marinas when you pull in you know, did you bring the boat all the way from Honduras, and how do you get the motorcycle up top, and you know, all of that stuff. And so it creates some good conversations. You meet some good people because of it, and actually, some of them have become boating friends over the years, and we've spent extended time with them when we're in their area.
Yeah,
that's good. It's one of those things.
Yeah, well, and that's very helpful information for non-US citizens who are considering doing the loop. We do have a webinar for any Canadians who are listening that is free to our members that kind of goes over the details for Canadians from the boat's perspective, from the people's perspective, because it's essentially all about immigration and taxation. So that's all out there. If there's others listening that are from other countries, the parts for the boat apply the same way. Basically, that cruising permit that Randy mentioned is still what you need for the boat, and we can help you with other details. So info@greatloop.org is the best way to reach out, and we can, you know, based on the specifics of our listeners, we can give you a little bit more information on that. But tell us a little bit, you know, in a trip that is full of highlights, pick out a few of what you consider kind of the biggest highlights of your Great Loop.
Oh my God. I don't know where you would start and where you would end. You know, there's everything from dolphins swimming off your bow. For us, I guess basically it was the wildlife and the scenery and some of the beauty of our natural surroundings. It was probably our biggest highlights. You know, we've been urbanites for most of our life, so the big city lights didn't really attract us that much, but some of that nature is spectacular and in its own way all around the loop.
I found Tangiers Island absolutely as unique and charming as possible. Of course, you know, the Georgian Bay is one of my favorites, but cruising into New York and you know, the Statue of Liberty is pretty spectacular. I didn't realize how beautiful she is, like until you're really close to her. So I really thought that was a pretty moving moment, you know.
Yeah.
You know, you arguably you have the best freshwater boating in the world with the Great Lakes. You have the best brackish water boating in the world with the Chesapeake Bay, and you have the best saltwater boating, you know, with the Bahamas. And so you have the best of all three worlds. You know, that's included in this little trip, and so anybody that's a boater, you know, you would spend a lifetime trying to do all of that in a year. And one of the things that really struck me about the loop is that you get to experience all three of those worlds in, you know, in a very short period of time.
Yeah, that's a great point. A lot of people talk about the different scenery, and you kind of mentioned the, you know, the bright lights of the cities versus the ruralness and the peacefulness of anchorages. But you're right, from the waterway perspective as well, you're getting a little bit of everything. Last question before we wrap up. Any other advice you would give to someone who's just now contemplating taking on the Great Loop?
Well, I certainly have. I mean, my advice is to become a weatherman. I think, you know, I mean, yes, everybody talks about knowing your boat and having boating skills and understanding the rules of the waterways, and all those things are extremely vital and important. But I think for me personally, learning how to read the weather, and I'm still not very good at it, but it's really important. And it's important before you're underway and while you're underway, because, you know, very often, as you know, the storms can come up while you're underway, and being able to thread that needle makes all the difference. You know, if you can, you know, run from the storm or run into the storm or whatever it is you need to do, and, you know, understanding what the radars are telling you and what the weather reports are telling you. I just can't express that enough. I think it's really important. It makes all the difference between a good cruise and a bad cruise.
That's great advice. Yeah. How about you, Randy?
For me, it's you know, we're all very anticipatory about entering new waters. It's all unfamiliar. A lot of it, you know, we all have our home waters and we're all very familiar with, and it seems like there's nothing to it. but that little bit of hesitancy to go into the unknown stops a lot of people from doing it. But fundamentally, you're planning, 50 to 100-mile cruises, and those aren't difficult to do. You can plan a 50-mile cruise, fairly simplistically. You just have to do that, 100 or 120 times.
Right.
And the loop is over. And so it's not quite as simple as Mike O'Malley says. You just make a bunch of left turns and you're back where you started.
Right.
But it is fairly simplistic if you take it a step at a time and a day at a time. And the way you eat an elephant is one bite at a time, and it's actually it's a very relatively easy journey to embark on. And I think fear stops a lot of people. We've noticed it in a lot of our home marinas. There's people that never get off the dock. They just use their boat for a weekend cabin, and they don't understand what they're missing out on, simply because they don't want to learn or take the risk or whatever it is that's stopping them. And but people that are avid boaters, to go on the loop is relatively pain-free. It's just throw off the lines and make your first 50-mile trip, and just keep doing that every day.
Yeah. And I should have mentioned your boat is named Persistence. So I know I said I had the last one was the last question, but I do have another one. How is that name meaningful to you? Why did you choose Persistence?
Well, it's kind of been my personal motto, and so when we bought our boat and were trying to figure out a name, Cathy said, "Well, you've been fairly persistent about this, so maybe that's a good name."
Randy likes persistence beats resistance, so that's how we got the name.
And it's not, every loop is different. Ours, there certainly were challenges. We had some issues. We talked about hoppies, but we had other issues as we went around. And I can't say enough good things about the AGLCA. I've been a lifetime member since I first joined up way back when to get some information. And without the people in that association, it made it so easy for us. Whenever we needed information, Joe Picca was cruising full time back then. He was a wealth of information. Jim Healy is still a wealth of information on a daily basis. Tom Conrad was alive then and providing the weather information for our crossings. And some of those people and they're producing new ones. The Herb Seatons of the world and the Foster of the world. They keep paying it forward, and I think that the association is probably the most valuable resource that anybody could have.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear that. We try hard to make it that way, and you're right. Those people that you mentioned, and it's just a really fabulous group of people who are really sharing and giving of their knowledge, and everybody got help along the way, and everybody has that idea of paying it forward, which is part of what makes it such a neat group. So agree with you wholeheartedly, and it was great hearing you mention some of those names from some of our perennial helpers there who continue to share great information all the time. So I know Persistence is for sale. She's probably in storage somewhere, I'm thinking, since you usually keep her in Canada. Is she in storage for the winter?
Yeah, it's in Port Huron, Michigan right now. And yes, we've decided to move on. We don't know whether we're going to downgrade or we're going to, get back to the dirt yacht or just exactly what we're going to do. But it's, it's getting we're getting a little bit on an age now, and it's a little bit big for what we need. Our lifestyle has changed, and getting the Harley on and off is getting to be more of a chore. Well, we maybe keep her feet underneath her, and then it's easier to get on and off it for an old fella like me.
Well, good luck with the sale. I know we have more and more families doing the Great Loop, and while they're not as concerned about the size, the 3 staterooms is a really big boon to families who are looking to do the loop. So best of luck with the sale of Persistence, and thank you both so much for sharing some of the details of your journey. It was really a pleasure speaking with you today.
You are more than welcome.
Thank you so much, Jim.
You're very welcome. And to everyone who has listened today, thank you for listening to the Great Loop Radio podcast. We will be back next week with another episode. Until then, safe cruising.